Stop for a minute. Not because you need another breaking news adrenaline hit, but because this is the kind of political threshold that only looks small until you understand what it unlocks. One vote, 218 to 217. That isn't a margin, it's a crack in the load-bearing wall. In a functioning system, big constitutional moves usually arrive with breathing room, clear majorities, broad agreement, time to prepare the country for what's next. A one-vote outcome is the opposite. It tells you the institution is split almost perfectly down the middle. And it tells you the next steps won't be guided by consensus. They'll be guided by pressure, fear, and survival instincts. And here's the part people get wrong. The House vote isn't the climax. It's the ignition. Impeachment in the House is an accusation. The trial in the Senate is the verdict. And the Senate math is merciless. So let's talk about what this kind of razor-thin vote actually means, why it's historically different, and the three pathways that could follow, one of which ends in a legitimacy crisis that no amount of cable news can contain. First, some context. When Nixon approached impeachment, the numbers moved in waves. The system signaled inevitability before the final votes arrived. When Clinton was impeached, the margins were larger, and the country, while polarized, wasn't balanced on a knife edge the way it is now. Even in Trump's prior impeachments, the House votes were clearer majorities. You could debate motives, but the institution itself didn't look like it might split in half. A one-vote impeachment is different. It means the coalition that voted yes is fragile. The coalition that voted no is furious. Every member knows the vote could have gone the other way, with one absence, one illness, one changed mind. And both sides believe the other side is trying to destroy the country. That combination is combustible. Now, here's the question Washington would immediately ask. If it took everything to reach 218, what would it take to reach 67? Because removal requires 2/3 of the Senate. And in a polarized era, that number feels impossible. It requires not just a few defections, but a coordinated shift large enough to trigger political earthquakes in multiple states. So why even talk about 67? Because impossible becomes possible under specific conditions. And if the political environment is unstable enough, those conditions can arrive faster than people think. There are three basic routes. Route 1, the evidence event. This is the smoking gun scenario, but not in the vague internet way, in the way senators mean it. Material so direct and so damaging that defending the president becomes more dangerous than convicting him. It could be a recording. It could be a document chain. It could be a cooperating witness with firsthand knowledge. It could be something that ties intent to action in a way that is hard to spin. The Nixon lesson wasn't that Americans suddenly became moral. It was that Republican senators realized they couldn't survive defending him once the evidence crossed a certain threshold. They told him the votes were gone, and the presidency ended. That's why everyone watches the Senate trial phase. Not because speeches matter, but because evidence does. Route 2, the money and donor panic. People outside politics underestimate how quickly donor behavior changes outcomes. Voters show up every few years. Donors shape the battlefield every day. They decide who can afford ads, staff, polling, legal teams, and primary defenses. If major funding networks go silent or start signaling that the president is now a liability, senators notice immediately. Because if you lose financial support, you lose your ability to survive a primary, and you lose your ability to define your own story. That's when senators start thinking, maybe the real risk isn't angering the base. maybe the real risk is being tied to a sinking ship while the money escapes. Route 3, the credibility figure. Every political collapse has a permission slip, someone who gives other lawmakers cover to do what they already fear they must do. In the Republican ecosystem, a figure like Mike Pence is uniquely positioned to play that role, not because he controls the party, but because he has credibility with parts of the base and long-standing relationships with institutional Republicans. If someone like that publicly says, "This is beyond acceptable," it changes the language available to senators. It allows them to frame conviction not as betrayal, but as duty. The key is that such a figure has to appear principled and unafraid, and they have to have little left to lose. Otherwise, the permission slip doesn't work. Now, even with these routes, the Senate remains the hardest barrier, which is why some people start whispering about the other constitutional tool that sounds like a movie plot, the 25th Amendment, Section 4. This is the mechanism where the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can declare the president unable to discharge the duties of office. Power transfers immediately, not after a trial, not after weeks, immediately. But Section 4 is also designed to be hard to use. It requires the president's own inner circle to act against him. And it triggers a predictable counter. The president can contest it, and then Congress has to vote to keep him sidelined. The threshold is high. The politics are brutal. The personal risk for cabinet members is enormous. So why bring it up at all? Because in a real crisis, people don't only use the tools they like. They use the tools that remain. And when you see officials quietly retaining private counsel or creating distance from certain conversations, it can signal that they're thinking about personal exposure, legal, political, ethical, if the situation escalates. Not proof of a plan, but a sign that the temperature is rising. Now comes the part most people avoid saying out loud. All of these constitutional mechanisms, impeachment, conviction, the 25th, assume the losing side accepts the outcome. They assume compliance. And that assumption is the real vulnerability. Because what if the Senate convicts and the president refuses to leave? What if he declares the process illegitimate and calls it a coup? What if he continues to claim command and uses his platform to keep millions of people emotionally attached to his claim? That's when legal crisis becomes legitimacy crisis. A legitimacy crisis is different from a lawsuit. Lawsuits have judges and deadlines. Legitimacy crises are about recognition. Who does the government treat as real? Who do agencies obey? Who does law enforcement protect? Who do governors follow? In a legitimacy crisis, the Constitution can provide an answer on paper, but paper answers still require enforcement by institutions staffed by humans. And humans hesitate when they fear consequences. That's why this scenario keeps national security professionals awake, not because it is inevitable, but because it is catastrophic if it arrives. Imagine a conviction vote. The Senate announces removal. The successor is sworn in. The process is complete. Then the removed president refuses to concede reality and refuses to leave. At that point, who decides what happens next? The Secret Service has to protect the president, but which one? Federal agencies have to take direction, but whose? The military follows the commander-in-chief, but which claim is recognized? If those answers are delayed, even by hours, uncertainty spreads. And uncertainty creates space for political actors to make their own calls. Some governors might declare they don't recognize the outcome. Some legislatures might pass resolutions. Some agencies might slow walk cooperation. The public gets two competing narratives of authority, and social media turns it into a war. History shows what legitimacy crises do. Disputed outcomes in the past have been resolved not by perfect legal clarity, but by bargains, threats, and raw power. And bargains often come with costs that last generations. So what does the public do in that kind of moment? No one can predict it perfectly, but you can map broad patterns of response. Pattern 1, exhaustion. A large portion of the country is tired. Tired of crisis, tired of outrage, tired of feeling like the nation is permanently on the edge. In that pattern, people absorb the outcome passively. They don't mobilize. They continue life. They adapt to whatever authority becomes dominant. The system stabilizes not because it is strong, but because the public is depleted. The downside is long-term. Cynicism becomes permanent, participation drops, and democracy becomes something people watch rather than something they defend. Pattern 2, mass but controlled protest. In this pattern, people show up in the streets, large crowds, sustained demonstrations, civic pressure. The goal is to force institutions to enforce the legal outcome and to make non-compliance costly. This can be disruptive but stabilizing if it remains lawful and disciplined. It signals that the public still believes the system is worth defending. Pattern 3, rupture. This is the worst case, where protests become clashes, where extremists interpret chaos as permission, and where enforcement becomes inconsistent. Rumor becomes weapon. Threats become common. And the country begins behaving like it has two governments competing for recognition. That's when democratic societies get permanently scarred. Because once violence becomes part of political resolution, every future crisis becomes easier to escalate. Here's the hardest truth. None of these outcomes is guaranteed. But the risk increases when the system is divided by one vote, and when political leaders treat legitimacy as optional. That's why 218 to 217 matters. It isn't a number. It's a measure of how thin the margin is between order and instability. So what should you watch for next? Not the loudest speeches. Watch the signals that indicate whether the Senate path is hardening or cracking. Do key senators begin using language about duty and oath rather than party loyalty? Do donors and funding networks shift publicly or quietly? Does a credibility figure step forward and give cover to wavering lawmakers? Do cabinet-level officials begin creating legal distance and preparing for exposure? Do institutions tighten security and contingency planning without making it public? Those are the signs of a system preparing for turbulence. The bottom line is this: impeachment isn't removal. It's the opening move. The Senate is the battlefield. And the real risk isn't only whether the votes exist, it's whether the losing side accepts the outcome if the votes do exist. That is the hinge point where a constitutional process either holds or becomes a legitimacy fight. And right now, the country is close enough to that hinge that pretending it's just another circus is the most dangerous kind of ignorance.